So Mr. Collette is here to go into further detail about what we are doing here, as you saw in our memo, and then there was a revised memo we sent out as well. We are asking that there are sort of three legs of the technology stool, so to speak, right? As I may have described before. One is network infrastructure, right? And Ms. O'Neill was absolutely correct, right? What does it mean if we become fully wireless everywhere? What does it mean for what we actually do with devices? Two is the standard equipment that classrooms should have, and it's sort of related to, so one piece of standard equipment that we believe classrooms should have is the Promethean board. And there are, quite frankly, arguments back and forth on that, right? Some people will say, well, why a Promethean board? Why not something else? And maybe we'll get into that. And you can, it's just like, you know, over my many years doing technology work in schools, some principals insisted that a computer lab was the absolute best way to integrate technology. Some principals insisted that having computers in their classroom was the absolute best way, and some people insisted that a mobile cart was the absolute best way. So they're all right, I guess, right? But it does seem that from everything we believe and know that having Promethean boards in each one of our classrooms provides a floor, so to speak, certainly not a ceiling. And the third piece of the stool is what I think is the work we really need to do, and something that, quite frankly, teachers, parents, students, and others have asked me about, which is, what's our plan in the future for technology? What does it look like for our students to be using technology in 21st century world? When are we going to go to handheld devices for everybody? Are we going to go to bring your own device? And in my estimation, over the last, being here now 14 months, whatever it's been, we seem to be, because of the funding issue, we seem to get caught up in the first two before we really start talking about the third, which doesn't mean that there isn't an enormous amount of work by Sherwin, by Eric and his team, by teachers and principals to be thinking about it and doing something about it in lots of creative ways. There's tons of evidence around the system that I've seen firsthand, and I know Sherwin could, talk for hours about the potential, but it seems like the actual planning around it sometimes gets stuck on the first two because of the monetary issues. So what we've brought forward, and what Sherwin will go into more detail around, and Mr. Barrows will go into more detail around, is by, through our proposal here and the recommendation, or the resolution we're asking you to act on, we'll be able to take care of the first two, so then we can focus our attention on the third. And meaning, what is the absolute, which speaks to the regulation that Ms. O'Neill brought up, because I can't answer the question as to when we will revise that until we talk to our students and we talk to our teachers and we look at the best research and say, what should we be doing? What are the different options? Is it same for everybody? Do we, how do we open it up? It's a lot of great work, but exciting work and wonderful work, I think, that can go on. So the overarching picture, I think, is that by taking care of the network infrastructure and the Promethean boards in the way that we are proposing, and I'm sure we'll discuss, we will then focus our attention at a sort of larger level on the very exciting proposition of what kinds of devices are best suited to learning in the kinds of way we want our kids to learn, and how do we make sure we're talking about that, not about who gets a Promethean board when, and when will we finally be able to get to wiring all of our schools. So with that, why don't I turn it over to Mr. Collette or Mr. Bowers to see if you just want to sketch out some of the details of the proposal briefly, and then I know board members have read the revised, and I'm sure have questions, and then we'll dive into that. Thank you.
So, good afternoon. I would just say very quickly, just to make sure I leave the time for you to ask the questions. As Dr. Starr just indicated, the work really here is on laying out a plan and integrating and developing, implementing a plan that builds for us the learning infrastructure that we need. That understands that we are seeking to create connected learning environments where we can create a seamless transition between the whole group work, small group work, learning environments that meet the needs of all of our students. We have evidence, direct evidence from testimony of teachers, students, parents about the direct impacts that we see through the integration of interactive classroom technologies that are in place today. We know we have lots and lots of work yet to do around the professional development and the work to create a greater degree of consistency around that. When we look at the learning infrastructure, when we look at that continuum, it is not just about a board and say, well, why are you going to spend this money on a board? It is how it is situated with the kind of networking infrastructure that creates this platform, and what we've really outlined around the funding and financing of it is very sound. I know that there are some questions related to, well, how do we use E-rate funds and such? I can clarify those, but I much rather get the questions and attend to them.
Just in terms of what we're proposing here, as you know, 4 years ago, we started with an initiative to put Promethean boards in all of our secondary schools. And over the past 4 years, some elementary schools have gotten Promethean boards, either through capital projects or oftentimes through fundraising through the PTAs. We currently have 34 elementary schools that have no Promethean boards. About 80 of our elementary schools have fewer than 10, while there are a handful that have Promethean boards in every room. So there's really are some disparities. And we've also indicated that 80 of our 31 of our 132 elementary schools, only 31 have full connectivity. And out of our high schools, only 11 have of our high schools have connectivity. We remember that part of the initiative in middle school reform was technology, so we did in fact put connectivity into all of our middle schools and began on some technology initiatives there, so they're a little bit further along. I just did a back of the envelope kind of calculation of the cost of Promethean boards, and if you look at it on a per student basis over the life of the Promethean boards, it's about $15 to $20 a year per student that we're spending on Promethean boards. I would venture to guess, I haven't figured it out, but I believe we probably spend more on paper, on copies we make for students every year currently, than we spend on Promethean boards. So that's just a way to look at the amount of money. Part of the challenge for a school system of our size is the numbers are always big because we have so many students in so many schools. So things seem like it's a lot, but when you put it in, try to get it down to the per student amount, we're not talking about that much money. And the challenge, as Dr. Starr laid out, is what's the next part of the conversation is really the more challenging part of the conversation about how do we integrate all of this into the instructional program and really make a difference in teaching and learning. And so on that note, I'll just turn it over to board members for any questions you may have.
Okay, got up next questions, Mrs. O'Neill.
Well, just a general comment and then sort of two short questions for you. If you rewound the tape to last November's CIP hearings, over and over again we heard from PTAs that we want Promethean boards. And just a few short months ago, we had Piney Branch Elementary School who mounted an email campaign with us and had speakers here at the table that they had no Promethean boards at Piney Branch Elementary, and that they believed that their students would be at a distinct disadvantage as they moved on to middle schools. But, Dr. Starr, as you started your comments, you must have read my question here, why Promethean boards? that's question number one. Why are we going with Promethean boards as opposed to some other maybe cheaper interactive whiteboard? Why? And then the other thing, for those who are watching at home and maybe have not pulled up the information, so this is also about completing, the wireless accessibility in all of the schools, and this would provide 0% financing and completing the Promethean boards way ahead of what we initially had projected over time. So those are just sort of the questions.
So I'll take the last one first and attend to the piece around the wireless. Again, part of, and related to the Promethean implementation, what we have essentially is a differential experience in the learning for our students by virtue of the fact that we've not, as Dr. Starr indicated at the top, have not had a systemic and systematic way of implementing these technologies. So schools where mobile technology, where the wireless infrastructure exists, they have greater flexibility about how they design the instructional day and things that they're able to do. In addition to which, without the wireless infrastructure, we are then forced to try to provision for that. So when schools opt for netbook carts or laptop carts, we are then providing a wireless access point with each cart, which creates an immediate limitation because that laptop is able to connect to the internet only where it exists in proximity to that wireless access point. And even when we provide, say, a dozen or 8 or 10 netbooks or laptops with that cart, we know that there is a degradation in performance when they're all on it together. So I remind my staff, I remind others that our responsibility for provisioning a wireless network is not the same as if we go to our neighborhood coffee shop or bread store and open up our laptops and go. We actually have to provide much more robust bandwidth. Think about for a moment when you have computer labs adjacent to each other, you have classrooms where students are all at the same time going to be using these technologies. It has to go. You have to be able to access the content, the curriculum that you need to access. Fast forward to a year or two from now when we have this fantastic unfunded mandate of online testing. That's not the time for us to be wondering, geez, am I connected? Is it going fast enough? Can I get through? So we must have across the entire system a roadway system that enables us to teach, to learn, to assess learning in a way that we can rely on and create and support the kinds of instructional strategies that we know work for our kids and for our teachers. Getting back to the first question about why Promethean boards, and I think, as I alluded to at the very beginning, the end stop, the period in the sentence shouldn't be at it's a board or interactive whiteboard and stop. It really is, as it relates to and as it's connected to that ecosystem in a classroom that we are building towards. One that includes how does a teacher create and help to facilitate learning in an environment where the whole group work can be equally as dynamic as when we transition to small group work, or that if we have center-based learning, that students can engage in those centers in ways that the teacher's been able to prepare the lesson, including recordings that she may want to have brought in, integrate a multimedia rich set of environments and resources for kids to access, and still be able to attend to students who are, as we anticipate through the provision of wireless networks, on their devices, whether they're working individually, collaboratively, or cooperatively with partners, and then be able to, as a result of their work, then present and share that work around what their groups or what they've been doing individually, and be able to have a way in which to share that in the whole. So if you think for a moment that, as a crude analogy, when you think about the design of shopping malls are all constructed around some key anchor stores. They're building blocks. They're the big shopping mega stores that invite the biggest amount of traffic. The Promethean board, the Promethean interactive whiteboard, provides for us the ability to draw the traffic, to begin to create ways in which we can, from a whole group or small group perspective, integrate many aspects of pedagogical strategies that we want to be able to use, the types of tools that make it seamless and easy for teachers to get to the resources they need because they're already embedded, that enables us to be able to connect with and leverage what other teachers may have done, because through the work that Promethean's done and their Promethean Planet, there's an amazing repository of lessons on which teachers can draw. And unlike if I were to sort of, as some have suggested, rig up, and I certainly can, and a sort of simulated interactive whiteboard, I don't have all of those supporting resources. I don't have the software that drives it, that runs it, that I could then embed and integrate into my lesson from the time I begin to plan it. And so there may be examples where people say, well, I read on a blog that a teacher is using just a dry erase board, and they've created their own interactive surface, and they're using the Promethean software. Well, here's what we don't want to do. We don't want the software police ever chasing us around the block saying that we owe them licensing fees. They're hefty, and we don't want to be there at all. Each year we go through a very specific purpose of truing up on our licensing so that we stay out of substantial penalties or any disputes in court or litigation about it. So what we're providing with the Promethean Interactive Whiteboards is an integrated whole around the kinds of resources that teachers need and students need and can use to teach and to learn. And specifically around Promethean, we know that the technology that they provide, we don't need to be concerned. I mean, the conversation about the modernization of Edison and Wheaton notwithstanding, our school environments are fairly tough places on different technologies. And we need to have the investments we make. We want to be sure that they can last and will not be compromised because of the environment in which they exist. We know that when we think about where the technology that we would be procuring from Promethean is, we have the ability to certainly have more students engaged with and at the board than other competitors. We know that it integrates both pen and touch. We know that the integration of its learning response systems are not proprietary, that lock us into only this vendor perspective. We've taken a perspective that our platforms, our solutions need to be cognizant of and be flexible enough to grow as we take different decisions about how we integrate content from publishers, look at ways to leverage those tools so that if, for example, I want to use an equation editor or some other piece, I'm not locked from doing that with that same student response or learning response system by having to buy another piece. The idea here is to simplify what teachers need to be able to do and to simplify those transitions.
Ms. Berkey?
So I have I guess, fairly lengthy comment. Let me start by saying that to the extent that questions have been raised about the bidding process, I see Mr. Kaufman has his light on, so I'll leave that to him. In regard to the questions that have been raised about Promethean or not, I'll come back to what Mrs. O'Neill said, which is that we heard repeatedly, and I think we've all heard repeatedly from various parents, that as Curriculum 2.0 is implemented, there's a definite feeling out there of haves and have-nots, and that there's really, I think, little doubt in my mind, although you may be able to implement 2.0 without the Promethean board, it's a heck of a lot easier, apparently, to implement it with. And so while, if we could rewind time, I might not be a person who would have voted for, installing Promethean boards. Here we are, and we need to get everybody at least at the same place. And for that reason, I don't see as we have any choice but to equalize everybody out and get all of our system in the same place before we move any place beyond that. That said, I'm not convinced that 10 years from now, this is where we're going to be. I was on the Avery County, North Carolina website the other day, and their K through 5 are all getting iPads, and 6 through 12 are all being issued MacBooks. North Carolina has a virtual high school, and anybody in North Carolina can register for free to take Mandarin Chinese or AP whatever as part of their course offerings at their high school. Their high school doesn't offer those courses, which greatly expands cost-free, the courses available to every student in North Carolina. I'll note I found it really interesting that in fact you could register from out of North Carolina, out of state for $500 per course, which was cheaper than some others I've seen. So, we're getting to a world where the homework is create a PowerPoint. And we're going to need to get there somehow. So, again, I would agree with Dr. Starr. This is a floor. It's a floor we need to get to for parity. Contracting questions aside, but it's not necessarily, from my point of view, an endorsement of this is the answer to the changing technological world, which honestly has changed faster than it's almost year to year anymore. Just think, whoever heard of Droid 3 years ago, right? So we'll see, but for right now, I think it's a necessary step, and there we are.
So yes, you capture it very well, and I think that it's important that folks understand that this is not about either or. Part of it is, quite frankly, and I think you did a very good job of summarizing, Ms. Bethune. Part of it is that we have made this commitment to the Promethean Boards. No one knows what anything's going to look like in 10 years when it comes to technology. I'm laughing at what people will be saying about this iPad back then, and my kids in particular, I'm sure, will laugh at me. And this is a floor. So now, and I will say that from my estimation, I've been somewhat frustrated this year, as Sherwin can attest to, over how we get stuck, perhaps, in the conversation about who's getting Prometheans when. I get frustrated personally when I'm in schools and I take my iPad with me or people now also know I take notes on my wireless devices, and all of a sudden I'm not able to do that because it's not wireless, it's wireless, and those seem to be the floor. So yes, we should be thinking deeply and almost solely on what are the kinds of opportunities that we're creating for our kids to be engaged in learning in different ways, whether it's mobile, whatever it is. And in our context, we need to just take this off the table, right? Just let's move on. Sherwin's come up with a great idea to do that. Let's move on. Let's make sure, and again, this doesn't exceed our capital budget at all. It's a pretty straightforward request we have to the county council. Let's do it, move on, so we can focus on just what you're talking about. So I appreciate that summary.
Mr. Kaufman?
Well, I agree with everything that's been said, and certainly I'm not going to be anyone advocating that we not move ahead with technology. I mean, this is today's technology. I mean, years ago, having a TV and a VCR in a classroom was considered great technology. So these are just moving targets, and we need to do what we need to do. But my concern is that we make our absolute best case for why we're doing these things, because not only is it for us, but it's going to be for the county council. We're going to be asking their appropriation of funds for that. So, moving to the wireless piece, you sort of addressed it, but if you had to elaborate on, tell me, why do we need wireless technology? I mean, is it going to be for the kids walking in with their laptops so they can connect, or are we not going to let someone walking into a school building connect to our wireless system? Is the wireless technology really for the school-based equipment? I mean, exactly why do we need the technology at the three levels? What do we plan to use it for? So I just think we really need to lay that question out, right, so that it's not just, wireless is good because wireless is good. what exactly is the justification for why this is the best use of our dollars?
So one of the things that we know quite clearly is that the ways in which we live outside of the workday and we learn outside of the workday, we like to have those experiences not be so dramatically different. Our students don't want to be able to feel as if they have to sort of gear themselves down when they walk into our schools. And our staff similarly are positioned, right? So when you think about how I may, again, expect to go to my neighborhood coffee shop, open up, and do whatever I want to do, we expect that staff want to be able to do the same thing when they come, and the same for students. So I had a principal describe to me part of the case argument for that when he was describing that as part of the robotics competition, his students, in order to really compete effectively, had to bring their own laptops to debug their programs and to collaborate with each other. They didn't have access to those resources and to the wireless services at the school in the way in which they needed it. And so the notion around when we talk about the wireless network, we're talking about many components to it. And it's not a closed environment. It actually is an enabling set of technologies that will provision at the same time our ability to segregate the network so that staff and students can indeed bring their own devices to school. Now, there's a really pragmatic reason for doing that, right? I mean, it's not only that we need to move there, but among the pragmatic reasons is, if we think about graphing calculators, students who can afford, they will bring their own graphing calculators, they bring them. Students who are unable to, we provision them for them. So 149,000 students and growing when we think about any notion of a one-to-one strategy about deploying technology. So I really chuckle at the people who say, well, why don't you just give every kid an iPad, right? I mean, it's the new sexy. We think you can do all these things with it. That's about $60 million, right? And so when it dies in 2 years, you have to have a replacement strategy to deal with that. So our ability on that level alone to be able to do that makes sense. Secondly, I would point to the idea that the requirement, quite frankly, that in an elementary school, there is but a single lab. Some elementary schools are making the choice of late to say we need that instructional space, and so we'll trade and redistribute the computers in and across our classrooms. Well, the computer lab as a hub, where I need to move out of my classroom and go to someplace else to access the technology is a rather outmoded model, and we need to drive those experiences directly in the classroom spaces. Well, we actually have begun to take steps towards that by provisioning in many elementary classrooms in particular some number of computers in the classroom. But their desktops means that they're fixed, so only a certain number of students have to leave their seats to go in the back of the room then to use those computers. If we want to assess students, it creates a whole different design model for what the teacher needs to deal with. So we recognize that the march towards mobility, flexibility, not just from an assessment perspective, but in our ability to personalize and customize the learning for students. When we think about how we can really activate learning groups of students around certain curricular activities, the need to do that with a mobile device becomes more important. And so in order to facilitate that, we need to have the infrastructure. We need to have a network that will enable that. We need to be able to have a network that allows us to manage that simply. Today we have in our network a real limitation in that not only does it not exist everywhere, but the security of it is not nearly what we really want for it to be. This implementation will allow us to really secure our networks in a far more sophisticated way, creating some separation around what those network keys look like, and customizing and tailoring those for each school. So the idea isn't to say that, well, we've somehow stepped forward and are just putting in wireless, but the connection to what it will support instructionally, the ability for staff and students to bring their own devices. There's a direct economic and financial benefit to the school system in terms of being able to provision the technology more broadly. When we think about where we're going around not only the teaching and learning, but the assessment as part of the teaching and learning, it becomes a requirement. When we ultimately think that with that kind of network environment, and Mrs. O'Neill raised the point, pointing towards the computers that our students are carrying on their phones, how do we integrate those, and our staff as well. I was saying to a group of staff this morning that the world around which we're trying to provision is not simply within our buildings, and it extends beyond that time, that school day, that work day, and the entire mobility in that continuum is going to be necessary for us to provision the resources so staff can work as effectively, our students could learn in creative and small groups. Our own curriculum is driving that as a mechanism and mode for how they learn and how we teach as well.
Before we move on to the questions on Promethean, could you just talk about the contract vehicle that you're using to buy the networking that's referenced?
So over a year ago, we issued an RFP for these services and products. So part of what we do is we go through an almost annual process, and in as much as these services are eligible for E-rate reimbursements, we're required to do so. We do that as a matter of course where it makes sense to go through those annual procurements. The incumbent that we had actually didn't win the bid. DICES, the provider here, a Cisco partner, did win the bid. The bid carried, the RFP carried with it a 1+3 annual renewals. We brought back to the board in February the first renewal after the year one of the term ended, and so the first contract term went through June 30th of 2012, and the renewal piece came before that. So it's a competitively bid solicitation that got us the provider that we have now, who's a Cisco partner in providing those services and supports.
Well, in terms of the quantities that we're purchasing, what were the quantities on the original buy, and now we're buying $5 million more?
Well, I think actually when we brought the bid through, it was just so in actuality there's probably about a $500 or $600 delta between what we projected spending and on that particular solicitation and what we'll be spending just on this acquisition. So the idea was not to have any potential bump ups around any limits. We said originally I think it was going to be 4-point-something million we would spend. Just to do this piece of it is over $5 million, and we know that we have other services that we will need to attend to, so we didn't want to then come back yet again and say, well, we need another increase in spending authority.
Last one, and then I'll let others into the conversation. I'll come back with more time. Okay. Mr. Manis.
I had two quick questions, kind of building off a little bit about what Mr. Kaufman had just said. My first question pertains to the wireless component that you had mentioned, and I know that, of course, for now there are a lot of applications for that as we move toward the 21st century classroom. But my question pertains to the fact that if we see a timetable where and I'm not setting anything in stone, but let's say 3 years, 5 years from now, we're in a situation where we feel that students are capable of bringing devices into the classroom, where we have more utilization of smartphones and computers integrated with the network. How can we be assured now, at 2012, that those networks and those logistical setups are going to be compatible and able to accommodate for what might be coming down the road 3 years, 5 years, 6 years from now?
So it's part of what we do around our due diligence and making sure that we're buying at the edge of where we need to be, right? So when part of the sort of counter argument when folks say, well, why don't you buy it cheaper? Or why don't you buy it like this? Part of what we're doing is building in the bandwidth and the planning around where where we seek to go. There are going to be many changes over the next 3 to 5 years, right? The evolution, the transition from IP4 to IP6 alone, and what that means around the nomenclature and how these networks will exist or work together or not work together, and what that means for the devices, routers, and switches that may or may not need to be swapped out. What I can say is that we're buying the most current technology with the most current software and thinking on the market space around how we manage the devices and manage the edge devices as well as the computing devices, whether they're, and so we're not buying that technology only to manage tablets, but recognizing any type of device that someone wants to bring and use, how do we actually manage and allow it to be part of the computing environment. We form those relationships with providers who we know are at the cutting edge and at the industry edge of understanding where we're going, and feel very confident that the technology will grow and evolve because we expect it to do that. What I see as actually a potentially greater issue is we size the network for certain capacity, and you put more capacity in than you need. This is one I believe that it's going to grow potentially even faster than we think, and in that particular instance, then that's an add to rather than a pull and a replace. So by that I mean for everybody else, you put a greater density of those access points to be able to facilitate the traffic. So I think we'll be okay.
Thank you. And the second question, really quick, pertains to the professional development of teachers and utilization with the Promethean Boards. And I don't know if that's directly a question for you, or if that might be a question that would have to be answered later. I don't know if Dr. Starr has any ideas on that, or at least what the planned layout for that is.
So, that's something we're certainly going to have to do, and I think there are a couple ways of looking at it. And let me take a little step back. Part of the issue here is that board members have really good questions. We have the same questions about this third piece of the technology stool, and part of the issue is we have to start planning, right? We got to bring all the right people together to say, all right, now what do we do? As it regards training for Promethean Boards, one, we have a lot of internal knowledge already. I mean, many of our schools already have them. There's tons of internal knowledge about how to use them already. We will have to figure out how to provide the appropriate level of training, and I don't know what our baseline or our minimum number of hours of training is when we roll out new ones, but we're just going to have to figure it out. I mean, we know how to do it. We've done it before. The teachers I've talked to that get them say it's a learning curve, but they play around with them. What usually happens is that some are more adept than others, and one of the reasons why we're so invested in professional learning communities is so we can figure out where the higher capacity is and how you get people to collaborate on the learning around it. So it's just simply a matter of ramping up the capacity we already have to do it. So I don't know exactly what the minimum number of hours is, but we'll be able to take care of it.
I think the piece that I would elaborate on that would be to say, so my office, in partnership with other offices, in curriculum, special education, student services, for example, provide real-time training, shoulder-to-shoulder support. We provide professional development opportunities through CPDs. One of the sort of value adds that Promethean provides for us is that professional development support and staff that's here to support that effort. When we contemplated what this implementation will look like coming to the board today and moving forward, we know that we'll be working very, very closely with principals and their staff around the timing of the rollout and sequencing support and professional development for staff. And I would say it's an ongoing effort. So you think about the implementation of an innovation. People go through very different places of their comfort level until they get to the place where they're actually comfortable enough to work with and share with others. But we have a number of resources through Promethean and Promethean Planet, our own repository of teacher resources, and we have different models around how we work with cohort groups, how we work with whole schools, how we work with leadership teams to support that effort.
Thank you.
Mr. Durson?
Going back, Mr. Collette, to a response you made to an earlier question about needing a replacement strategy, do we need that for Promethean boards, or is that just a bigger unknown further down the road?
I'm trying to remember the comment on replacement.
I think Mr. Kaufman asked something concerning other types of technology rather than Promethean boards, and you mentioned that one always needs to think about a replacement strategy.
So my comment, I think perhaps at the time, was thinking about sort of the hue and cry for tablets or certain things that when folks say, well, give everybody tablet X, and there isn't a look at, once we buy them, then their consumable lives is not forever. So we have a ways to we need to be able to think about that. One of the nice benefits around the Promethean technology is that as a hardware device, we figure we can get a fair number of years out of it. The biggest sort of replacement piece there is on the projector bulbs. When you think of projector, typically has about 3,500 hours or so of useful life, depending on the conditions and the amount of use. Overall, and Dr. Strauss spoke to this at the onset, in everything that we're trying to do and what we've laid out and the work that we're doing is not simply about the acquisition of the technology, but having a path that looks forward in terms of how we continue to build and evolve it, and knowing that we must have ways to replace and refresh what we're doing. It's why we've made the case arguments that we've had with the executive and the county council about the need for a sustainable source of funding for the technology modernization program, so that even as we think about Promethean technologies or mobile devices, we are at the same time already. So the conversation around to buy or not to buy in those pieces is sort of like the duck on the water. There's a whole lot of paddling going on under the surface around what we really need to do to be programming for how we sustain this programmatically. So we're looking at the budget in terms of how we need to rebuild it, how we need to reconceive and reconceptualize every nickel that we plan to spend, so that we actually have a way to leverage this infrastructure, and then once we build on it, okay, then how do we refresh it, maintain it, and because it's going to change, and we have to be able to tweak and adjust as we go forward.
Further down the road, and maybe this is more of a philosophical question, are we going to be forced to look at the resources we put in textbooks?
Well, I don't think it's that far down the road. I think it's in the now really, because when we think about the shifts, and the last time we did a presentation around technology, one of the things I highlighted was just think of the sort of store impacts, right? Think of Amazon's impact on Barnes and on Borders. Think of where Blockbuster is as a no longer a retail front compared to where Netflix is. So the same is true as it relates to the printed form. And so without question, I think the struggle for publishers is, and it's not so much a struggle because colleges are doing this already, really. It's really, as the technology evolves, how do you have a natively created digital text, right? Much of the digital text today are really dressed up PDFs. So the idea is to actually have, so it's sort of an ironic notion that on a highly interactive sort of computing devices, whether it's a tablet or an interactive whiteboard, much of the content from a text perspective is really flat. You can interrogate it and play our curriculum and our resources, you can. So the timing around textbooks and the bell's tolling there. So that's in the right now.
Mr. Barclay?
Sorry, I had to step out. was hoping to,
Glad to have you back.
glad to be back. Let me tell you. I guess I have a couple questions. I'll go from the ugly to the more interesting. One of the things is, given we are moving everything that we have digital, basically, and you've raised the question in terms of our bandwidth and capacity, and that is a huge issue in terms of what we need now compared to what we'll need in 3 years, you know, given more and more. If you just talk about that answering that question, the moving away from a hard copy to a digital text, one, I guess the issue is, how do we deal with the securing our network so that we minimize outages, and deal with that issue, because as an asset, you know, our digital content is becoming exponentially more valuable, you know, and so therefore all of those servers that it sits on become, we're starting to get to a point where we really do not need 99.99, you know, and that's a hard thing to come to in the industry. So it's outages, but also attacks, and not necessarily having to go through all our strategies, but really looking at that as one of the issues that we have to deal with. It used to be that, you know, kids would figure out their ways to deal with changing their grades, but I have a feeling folks are going to be a little bit more interested in, you know, attacking the content that we have. The other issue is, and this has been asked, but I think we really have to address this. What is our training commitment? I mean, I've heard you speak to it, but there are a couple of elements in the questions I believe people have been asking. Our Promethean boards are a particular product that has this capability, and the capability is probably as large as this room. But we have a lot of users that use up about 1 seat's worth of its capability, and then we have other people that use up half the room's worth of its capability. But the reality is there's the whole other half of the room that isn't being used, you know? Because, I mean, if you look at just the materials that they give us when they sell us these or attempt to sell it, it's always amazing what can be done. But what becomes that floor, to the point that the superintendent was making, what becomes the floor of the training that we need to give to our teachers to maximize the cost benefit of that investment, you know? And I'm throwing them all together so I can stop talking and I'll just let you talk. And then lastly, it becomes the bandwidth issue. And I think, you know, John was raising this in terms of our capacity and looking at kind of understanding what we need now, but then really looking, and I know you always are, looking forward a few years to, you know, what may we need in 3 years or 4 years, you know, compared to what we need now. You know, and some of this will be easy to deal with because it will be cheaper, as it has always become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper to get that bandwidth, but it still is an investment that we need to make. So, security, training, bandwidth.
So I can't speak to the security and the bandwidth issues, other than I know that we have a great guy thinking about it, but just on the training piece. And this is sort of a non-answer because it's an explanation of where we are. We don't know yet. And the reason we don't know yet is because we have to do some work with our students and with our staff to say what's the best application of technologies in the classroom and for learning. And learning to facilitate an online course is different training than integrating technology into the classroom with handheld devices, which could include a smartphone, could include a tablet, which is different than simply using a Promethean board. And so there are going to be multiple points of entry around it. So part of what the issue has been, and I tried to say this in the beginning, is that because we've been spending so much time on who's getting Prometheans when, How are we going to fund it? Who's getting wireless when? How are we going to fund it? We haven't been focused on what's the vision for what every kid should know and be able to do, what every teacher should know and be able to do, and then where are all the training resources going to go along with it. So it's not that we want to punt on the question, but I also don't want us to suggest that simply by doing this, particularly the network piece, that means, headline, everyone bring wireless devices tomorrow and you'll be able to use it. Every teacher, we're going to reduce our textbook expenditures by X percentage within 2014, 2015 budget. Now we have to get our students in particular, but also our teachers certainly to say, what's the best use, what should it look like, and then come back. And that's the accountability you got to have ask about. So it's the right question. I just know we're not able to answer it.
Right.
I know you
think
appreciate.
I'm really looking, and I know I've asked the question, but I think what I'm looking for is at some point I believe we have to have a discussion, and then also we're going to need to determine what are those indicators that allow us to see that we're marching along that path correctly. Because I believe that Mr. Colette's office and Dr. Statham's office have a lot of work to do together on that question, and then it becomes a whole another issue with Dr. Narvez's office about how are we supporting the schools to get what they need. The resource in terms of being wireless across all of our schools will be great, but then there'll be that so what question, which is and now how will they be used? How will that be used?
So what we know at a minimum is that whatever we do around working with teachers and teaching and learning is that the professional development it's not about how do you just use some bells and whistles on technology X or Y. It's really grounded in making those curricular connections. It's really grounded in helping model for and work with teachers on developing the technological, pedagogical content knowledge that they need to be able to help drive and facilitate the use of these technologies. And what does that then mean for what are the students doing, what are the teachers doing? So it's as Dr. Starrs indicated, it's a broad-based effort. Your question went to the place around what's our commitment. Well, our commitment is there because nothing's going to happen magically by simply implementing, installing technology and expecting that magic's going to happen. And we're very interested in under what conditions. I mean, and so you can always go to teacher X's classroom to see great things that she's doing with technology, and everybody marvels. We're far more interested in the teacher who appears to be reluctant, who has concerns. How do we actually understand those and meet them and attend to them in modeling for her or him how they actually teach effectively through the integration of technology and engage our students in meaningful ways. The other two parts of your question dealt with bandwidth and outages. So, one of the intriguing truisms about education, K-12 education, a school system, is that we have very curious and enterprising users who are trusted users who, particularly in the springtime, get particularly curious about how these things work. So we continue to be vigilant around our entire security infrastructure. I mean, I think when you think and you look at places like the SANS Institute and the different walls of protection, we meet each one of those to be sure that we provide multiple layers of security protections. Anyone who is involved and engaged in securing networks never rests on feeling comfortable that today was great, so tomorrow is going to be perfect, right? So we're ever vigilant. We are, to that end, both in terms of looking at outages and eliminating them, and attending to bandwidth. We're in the process of completing an in-depth study of our network infrastructure, its design, with the notion that we want to and need and must have a network that's sufficiently resilient, available, extensible, meaning we can continue to build on it in ways that we're not locked in, and that are positioned to transition with it as the technology itself evolves. that the findings of that study that really looks at network traffic, endpoints, all those different pieces, I will get a report and presentation on that, I would imagine, I think somewhere within the next 2 weeks. And we will add that to findings that we've been other studies that we've been conducting around other aspects. I mean, so as we implement expand our Mind CPS portal, there are a number of those kinds of pieces that we've been reevaluating. How is our identity management posture? What are we looking at around our SharePoint infrastructure? How robust is our Exchange architecture? So we've gone through a number of architectural reviews and looking at and paying attention to those. And as well, we had another sort of real-life experience around the derecho. What that allowed for us to do was to actually learn from our experience again, right? So we had the experience. Did we learn from it? Where did we do well? What opportunities exist for improvement? What factors do we not control that we probably need to influence differently so that we don't bear the impact of those? Because our expectation is that we manage, operate, and extend a network that is indeed sufficiently resilient so that whether we can or not occupy the buildings, the network's there and ready so that we can continue operations and learning from remote locations.
Okay. Looking at the clock, and I'm thinking about the vote in front of us, we've had some conversation around why Promethean Boards, we've had some conversation around why wireless technology. We've also had an acknowledgement that in terms of if we conceive of this moment as using some of the resources we can access to sort of level the playing field, an acknowledgement that there will then be another conversation about going forward. So having set that stage, I want to give board members a chance. If there's anything else you need to ask before we vote on this resolution.
Just a couple real basic questions.
Sure.
Is the plan right now we have the Prometheans in 65% of our secondary schools. Is the plan for elementary, is it 100%? Is it 65%? What percentage of our
100% elementary.
Okay. And of the secondary schools, is there any plan to address the 35%?
As soon as we get more money.
Okay. And just talk to me about the contract vehicle that we're using to buy the Promethean boards.
So we're planning to use a state contract that was let. In fact, the state has they reissued the RFP for that, and it's unclear at this point when they will make an announcement about the successor to the vehicle that we're using. Most of the jurisdictions, most of the LEAs in the state of Maryland buy from some other entity's contract for lots of products and services, including interactive whiteboards. So again, a solicitation that resulted from an RFP with extensions. The vendors provide their catalog of services. This particular contract, if you think about the time in which it was let in 2007, and the description of the language, I will imagine is going to be slightly different when the new one is issued, to be more specific, because there wasn't an anticipation. I mean, I've tried to go back to be historian about what some of the thinking was. There wasn't an anticipation, I don't think, 5 years ago that what was anticipated as a peripheral would expand and be such a central piece and be less peripheral and more central. And I know that it's certainly been a conversation on the renewal of the MEEC contract, which is another state vehicle from which we procure these technologies, about how to classify it differently so that it's more explicitly stated and at what dollar values. So again, this the State Department of Technology, I believe, is leading the renewal. It was the Department of Management and Budget, DBM, that had the first solicitation. They had their opening, and so my guess is that they will either, if they're pressed and don't think that they will take a final decision on the renewal or the successor agreement, issue an extension to the contract. But it's a state vehicle from which we buy millions of dollars of technology. Just like the MEEC, we have that option to go MEEC or state, this particular state contract.
Is there a reason why we use that vehicle as opposed to doing our own RFP?
Well, because it was already done, and the piece around, I mean, the real what I've seen personally, what I, there is a false sense of security. I'm just going to say it very directly about what we think we get when we issue the RFPs, because you can structure an RFP anyway to get the particular vendor you want to get, I'm trying to figure out how to say this really emphatically. We don't play games with contracting, and I take very, very seriously the fiduciary responsibilities that I have. There are state and regional contracts available to us. We bridge them all the time to buy lots of services. This isn't a unique animal. Where we really spend our time is in ensuring that we're getting maximum value for the things, the goods and services we're buying. If you look at where we are in our last buy, we're buying in the Promethean acquisition. I'll set aside the Cisco piece for a moment. In the Promethean acquisition, we are saving over $3.2 million off of what we spent the last time around, or most recently on what the MCPS price was, which already was better than retail. I see sort of crazy numbers about what a particular Promethean board is. We have to, when you think about the total number, it's not just the interactive whiteboard, it's the learning response systems that are there, it's the document cameras that are part of that, it's the slates that are embedded in that, so it's the option for anticipating building our wireless networks, being able to deploy the learning responses on tablets and laptops. So we spend our time in making sure that we're driving value around the price that we're paying, and more importantly, the supports to implement them successfully. The same is true with Cisco and the wireless technologies that we're procuring. Together, those two purchases are well over $6 million in direct savings, and savings that are coming by way of the supports, in particular in Cisco's side around the supports that they will provide to be sure that my staff's trained and that we implement the technologies effectively. Lots of people buy stuff even when they go through RFPs, and it becomes really good shelfware, or it's not implemented as effectively as it should. There isn't, from our perspective, anything unique about this solicitation. The contracting vehicles already are there. The time and energy to expend doing that didn't seem, there was nothing unique. We were extending the schedule on what we're buying coming up the last significant large-scale procurement, and we had different options to go. It seemed better to stay within the state's vehicle rather than go on one of the regional buys that were there.
And just in the interest of time, right? And just maybe a follow-up. I just want to get digging a little deeper in the why Promethean question. So maybe, in terms of comparison to other brands, why exactly we're justifying that particular. Maybe that's something you can follow up.
I sure can, and I think it's a number of the value propositions around making the technology work successfully, and the technology itself. But we can.
And if you could compare it to other brands that are out there,
sure,
and say why this is better than the others, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Mike?
Actually, this is a quick question for you, Madam President. What are we getting ready to vote on?
This is the resolution 4.4.1. So this was it's a resolution asking the board to approve a request that's going to go to the county council seeking a supplemental appropriation so that we can use the E-rate funds to purchase the Promethean interactive technology and to make the purchase through Cisco on the wireless technology. I do want to make sure, board members, if you have any questions about what's included in this, I want to make sure everybody does understand the scope, so I'll give folks a minute to look it over. So this is 4.4.1. Revised. 4.4.1.
Yeah, there are actually, and again, we've combined a number of things in this, and, we were discussing whether we were going to have 2 or 3 separate resolutions. We put it all into one, so you're actually authorizing the purchase of both the Prometheans and the Cisco technology. You're requesting a supplemental. You're approving the financing of both of those, and then you're requesting a supplemental appropriation from the county council for the E-rate funding for $2 million for FY 2013.
Any other questions on that, Mr. Kaufman?
But we only make the buy if the county council approves the appropriation?
That is the way we're presenting it. We've had a lot of discussion around this, and so we need the council to get on board with this. And so to make this happen for this purchase this year, and the long term, we've got to get their support for the supplemental. So,
any other questions on anything in the resolution? Okay, we've had a motion and a second to 4.4.1 revised. All those in favor, please indicate. Mr. Manis, Mr. Kaufman, Dr. Daka, Mr. Barkley, Ms. Brandman, Ms. O'Neill, Ms. Perfume. All those opposed, Mr. Durso. Okay, the motion does carry. Okay, thank you.